The US is going through a very tough time, and I think it's critical for us to reaffirm some of the things that uh, affect our nation and are part of our nation's history. And then I want to just talk a little bit about how each one of us can be part of the change that we wish to see in the world. I feel like I'm speaking to the choir, so I know all of you are here wanting to know how you can contribute to promoting more justice in the American society and in the world as a whole. And Carolyn asked me to speak from the heart, so I will try to do that. And I imagine at some point you will be able to see that it's an emotional topic, an emotional issue for me, as I know it will be for each one of you. But by the time it's over and done with, I think we will be able to have a really fruitful conversation. So let me begin with talking about Americans, and really Americans live in arguably the greatest nation in the world, a country that is blessed with tremendous natural resources and wealth. And believe me, I've lived and traveled in very different parts of the world, and there is no place so rich in opportunity, so abundant in wealth, so diverse in its scope. And many times we don't think about it, but everyone who is in America is blessed beyond measure. And one of our great blessings is this, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, and that they have been endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These noble ideals are at the very psyche of what defines us as a people. They're at the very psyche of what defines Americans. When you think about the ideals of democracy, of freedom under law with justice and equality for all, these have inspired millions of people and nations the world over and have had a tremendous shaping influence on the development of thought, the development of politics, and the quest for freedom worldwide. I dare say that from the time of its inception, the American nation believed itself to be a nation of great destiny and noble mission. But at the same time, we have always embraced the contradictory set of values. The founding fathers, on the one hand, proclaimed their devotion to the highest principles of equity, of justice, and equality, yet we enshrine slavery and the second-class citizenry of women into the Constitution. The confiscation of native lands, the oppression of indigenous peoples, the indentured servitude, which helped with Western expansion. This is the stuff of American history. In spite of our great ideals as a nation, our reality has often been one of inequality toward Native people, people of color, and women. And I dare say and remind all of us that the wounds of our history are indeed very deep. All of you know that chattel slavery was not eradicated without a devastating civil war, a war that cost more lives than have been fought and have been lost in all the wars that America has fought before or since put together. When we think about the dehumanization and the cultural genocide against Native and indigenous peoples, when we think about the psychological scars of slavery that are still with us today, whether manifested in low self-esteem among Blacks or often subtle and unconscious feelings of superiority toward among whites, when we think about the current economic inequality, glaring inequality that exists along racial and gender lines, the sense of hopelessness and disenfranchisement, which leads many young people of color toward gang life, and the not talked about cultural violence that exists in our society toward women. These are all legacies of our paradoxical past, but they are also a reality of the present, and they continue to be a threat to our common future. So healing the wounds of injustice by working toward human rights, by promoting unity and inclusion, and safeguarding the fundamental, unalienable rights of every human being is truly what I believe will make this country great and ensure the vision of our forefathers and mothers becomes a true reality. I am a member of the Baha'i faith, and the Baha'i writings state that the best beloved of all things in God's sight is justice, and that the purpose of justice is the appearance of unity amongst men. My wife and I named our son Justice, not because he's more beloved than his sister Jasmine or his sister Juliet, but because we wanted to always have a constant reminder in front of us about the need and the importance of people working toward justice. And so let me say to you, I believe wholeheartedly in humanity's capacity for unity, but I submit to you that for that eventuality to occur, people must be committed and willing to work for justice. And so let me just say before getting to some of the solutions to the challenges our country is going through, I just want to say how thrilled I am that all of us who share similar thoughts are united here, similar sentiments. And I submit to you that whatever our background, our culture, or our color or country we've come from, all of us who find ourselves associated or living in this great American nation, understanding our own country's need for the healing of the wounds of injustice that still exist, must also understand that the need is even greater in places that have not been so inspired. The world really looks to the United States for leadership in so many ways, and this is one of the ways in which the US has in the past been a beacon light to the world. But we must overcome this dark moment that we currently face and reaffirm who we really are as a nation. So protecting the fundamental freedoms that we hold dear is what unites all of us as Americans. And I submit to you that it is part of America's great destiny. So let me review a little bit of what we know. Racism is a cancer in the world, and you can't treat cancer lightly. All of us who are here want to be part of the solution. That's something else we know. Another thing we know is that Blacks and white and American can have totally different views of what is going on in America. One thing anthropology has taught us is that people define reality based on what they experience. Women experience totally different reality than men in many situations. I've always been a tall, athletic man, and I don't think about my personal safety when I go out of the house, but I fear for my daughters, I fear for my wife, I fear for my sisters many times when they are out, because I know of the cultural violence that exists toward women and girls. And so we may live in similar situations, but we often experience different realities. We also know that we all have blind spots about the experience of others. You know, there's a famous Will Smith quote that's been played in the media recently where he did an interview with Stephen Colbert a couple years ago, and Stephen Colbert was asking, so is racism getting worse in America? And Will Smith answered, racism isn't getting worse, it's getting filmed. And so that bears a great reflection on our part, because that is part of the reality that many Black people have dealt with for years and years and years and years, but it wasn't getting filmed. We also know that one of the key points that Dr. King helped to impress upon the American nation is that the passage of time alone was not enough to correct discriminatory systems of the past, that conscious efforts must be made to replace the old with the new. And when I talk about the old, let me just remind us that the US America basically had 250 years of slavery that was sanctioned and institutionalized, and used every single effort to basically break a people who were enslaved. In addition to those 250 years of institutionalized slavery, we had another 100 years of Jim Crow apartheid, where again, on an institutional level, Blacks were not allowed to own property, were not allowed to go to schools, were not allowed to advance economically. And so that is the history of our nation. 350 of the 400 years of American history is a history of tremendous oppression and suffering for people of African descent. And so we have to understand that it's in the fiber. It has attacked the entire social structure of American society. So we really need to reflect, not from a standpoint of guilt, because none of us were here back then, but we need to reflect from a standpoint of justice, because in the end, this is really a spiritual issue. We need to see, how can I be a part of the solution? How can I become more sensitized and aware? How can I help right some of the wrongs of the past? How can I become educated about what is institutional racism and how it affects people of color? How can I contribute to America's great destiny? How can I be my brother's keeper? How can I help? How can I help? How can I help? Carolyn asked me to speak from the heart, and once you start doing that, you start to feel a lot more. But something that guides me a great deal in terms of dealing with racial issues is what the Baha'i writings themselves say about the issue of race in America. It says that as to racial prejudice, the corrosion of which has bitten into the fiber and attacked the whole social structure of American society, it should be regarded as constituting the most vital and challenging issue confronting the Baha'i community at the present stage of its evolution. Now, mind you, this was written in a book called The Advent of the Divine Justice, which was published in 1938. And if those words were appropriate in 1938, and I believe they extend themselves not to just the Baha'i community, but to the entire American society, how appropriate were they in 1938, and how appropriate are they still today? And that quote goes on to say, the ceaseless exertions which this issue of paramount importance calls for, the sacrifices it must impose, the care and vigilance it demands, the moral courage and fortitude that it requires, the tact and sympathy that it necessitates, invest this problem, which the American believers are still far from having satisfactorily resolved, with an urgency and an importance that cannot be overestimated. The fundamental teachings of the Baha'i faith is that of the unity of the human race. So Baha'is have always been challenged to strive to promote unity. And the experience of the Baha'i community proves that this unity is possible. The 6 million or so people worldwide who call themselves Baha'is represent some 2,100 different racial, ethnic, and tribal groups, people of all backgrounds, cultures, religious traditions, and socioeconomic backgrounds who have come together and are striving to promote this unity and inclusion. So beyond that, what gives me confidence in humanity's capacity for unity is truly my own life experience, because I come from a wonderful interracial family. And I want to take a moment now to just tell you a couple stories about my family and have you meet them. I have 4 pictures to share, if you guys will allow me. And I want to thank my sister Ria for having documented these pictures, because I stole them from her website. She had written an article about my dad, and I went there and I took these pictures. But let me just share my screen if I can here. Okay, tell me, are you guys seeing on the screen a picture? Okay, I got a picture here, and this picture has my mother Jane right here, my father Edward James Howard, my beautiful chocolate brown sister Mary, my two white chocolate sisters Tina and Carolyn, and then a little milk chocolate baby named Tracy. And that was the blended family that basically, my parents basically had this blended family with three daughters. From the time they got married, it was a second marriage for each of them. My mother was married to Robert Reynolds, Carolyn and Tina's biological dad, but she was left widowed in 1950 when his plane was shot down over the Baltic Sea. And so she tried to put her life back together, came back to the States, and eventually found the Baha'i faith. And my dad, on his own, after coming back from World War II, had been married to Mary's mom, but eventually they separated, and he too found the Baha'i faith on his own. And then eventually my parents got married. And so when they got married and they had this blended family, interracial marriage was still legal in 16 states in the United States. But about 10 years later, they were living in Brazil. They had migrated to Brazil. And here there's an addition to the family. That little baby you saw in the previous picture was Tracy right here. Then Rhea was added to the mix. Then my brother Gregory right here. And then me right here. I'm the youngest in the family. And this gorgeous, exotic looking babe right here is Carolyn, in case you guys don't know. And then my sister Tina right here married my brother-in-law Celestino. And so this was a picture of the family back in the early 60s, I believe, early or late 60s, I believe. So let me just tell you something that is unique about this picture, and that is, in the Black experience, the institution of slavery caused a tremendous number of injustices to be perpetuated. And one of them was that of slave rape. And many children were born as people tried to break up Black families. But an ethic in the Black community was that every child is a child of God, and every child is innocent. And so one thing I know that my dad did very consciously in his family is he adopted his two white daughters, and he loved them just like he loved every one of his other children. And he never, ever made a distinction between his children. And that is something that continues to inspire me to this day. That is something that continues to give me hope. Let me share another picture with you. This picture has my father over here, my sister Mary right here in the middle, my uncle Everett, my mother Jane, and then a whole bunch of nieces and nephews, Tatiana, Dina, Joshua, and Simone, and then my brother Gregory and myself. And my brother and I, we were big-time basketball players in the city of Chicago once upon a time, and it was coming up on Carolyn's graduation from college. She was in Southern Illinois University. And my brother and I had this huge basketball tournament that we were supposed to participate in. But my father came and said, "We are going to your sister Carolyn's graduation, And we said, Dad, no, we cannot go. We have this tournament. We have to be there. The team is counting on us, et cetera, et cetera. But my dad would have nothing of it. He would have nothing of it. He said, your sister is graduating. We are all going to be there to support her. And that is final. And so I tell you that story because that is part of what gives me hope. That is an understanding that I got from my father about what is true, what is important, and what is unity. And so let me just show you one picture of my father and tell you one last thing that gives me hope before talking about some of the solutions that I think we can all agree on. Forgive me here, this moving from one place to the other is just a bit challenging. Okay. You guys seeing a picture of my dad on the screen? Okay. The Baha'i writings, Baha'u'llah in his writings once compared people of African descent to the black pupil of the eye surrounded by the white. And Abdu'l-Baha said, in this black pupil is seen the reflection of that which is before it, and through it, the light of the spirit shines forth. This pupil of the eye metaphor, in my understanding, recognizes what African Americans and people of African descent have witnessed and experienced historically, collectively endowing them with a heightened sensitivity to the suffering and oppression and deepening their capacity for empathy, social justice, and interracial harmony. This is what gives me confidence. This is what gives me a great deal of hope for the future. And this is what helps me understand as a person of African descent that all this suffering was not in vain. I was watching a World War II documentary that profiled what was going on in German society during the rise of Hitler. And it was amazing. It was truly amazing, this documentary, because it showed through the dialogue and the rhetoric in German society how Hitler was sowing division and disunity, how he was scapegoating not just Jews, but Slavs and Poles and Russians, anybody in the society who was different. And the slogan, the major slogan that he used in his rhetoric was that of making Germany great again. And in his rhetoric, he outright fueled the fire of white supremacy. And German people were not inherently bad people, but they went along with it. They didn't stand up to the authoritarianism and the bullying. They didn't stand up to the scapegoating and dehumanization. So we are living in a moment where we should all be inspired by so many young people and so many people of all backgrounds in the country protesting and standing up, because it's a big part of the solution. But we must remember that as soon as these protests ends, the work still needs to be done. People in their righteous indignation are finally starting to say that we are better than this. This is not who we are. This is not who we want to be. And this has got to stop. This has got to change. And I want to be a part of the solution. I know that Carolyn gets really, really angry about the issue of race and in America. And I believe that in her heart of heart, she knows on a very deep level that what happened to George Floyd could have happened to her father, Ed, her Black father, Ed. It could happen to her brothers, Charles and Gregory, if we were a shade or two darker. It could happen to her nephew, Joshua, and it could happen to a host of Black friends that she has. So I want to talk about 5 things that I believe are part of the solution, things that we can all be doing to make sure that we are always part of the solution. The first one is to stand up and be counted. White people need to stand up and be counted, just as men need to champion the cause of equality. Whites must stand up and be counted. This is not a Black issue. This is an American issue. It's an issue of justice. When you see injustice, we need to film it. We need to complain about it. We need to say, that offends me. We need to call a spade a spade. Many times men hear sexist jokes that may make them uncomfortable, but they don't say anything about it. You don't have to give a sermon to anyone, but when you see or hear something that you know is not right, we need to have the moral courage to say, that offends me. I don't like hearing those kinds of jokes. I don't like hearing those kinds of comments. I don't subscribe to that ideology. People need to stand up at every opportunity today and be counted. Second thing is we all need to re-educate ourselves about the issues of race and gender in America, and specifically institutionalized racism. Recognizing that each of us has blind spots and no one has a monopoly on the truth. We all have I believe, the responsibility to be lifelong learners on many issues, especially issues of race and gender. You know, in 1973, the US prison population was about 350,000 people. And then in the late 70s and early 80s, through the introduction of minimum sentencing guidelines and for certain crimes and misdemeanors, and the war on drugs, now we have over 2.3 million African Americans in the US prison system. More than 34% of the prison population in the US are people of African descent. And according to 2014 Human Rights Watch report, many tough on crime laws adopted since the 1980s have filled US prisons with mostly nonviolent offenders who are primarily Black, Puerto Rican, or Native American, but the vast majority are people of African descent. So African Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rates of whites in the US. There are a host of injustices in American society that persists if we don't understand the issue of institutionalized racism and policies that can contribute to unjust outcomes. A third thing that I want to mention before we get into our conversation is engage in dialogues about racial and gender issues. Everyone must be able to engage and not be afraid. Develop friendships with diverse people and ask them about their reality, what they experience. And don't fall into the trap of what's called a politeness conspiracy. Don't be afraid to talk about racial and gender issues. That's really how we learn. That's how we become sensitized. And so many whites don't want to talk about sensitive issues because they don't want to be uncomfortable and they don't want to make other people uncomfortable. When I was in college, in one of my African American studies classes, I read a book called Black and White Styles in Conflict. And this book talked about what's called this politeness conspiracy, that many whites don't want to talk because they don't want to make people uncomfortable and they themselves don't want to be uncomfortable. But the way that's interpreted by most Blacks and most minority people is, man, white people just don't care. They don't see what I go through. They don't want to talk about what I go through. They just don't care about this reality. They don't even explore the reality that I go through. And so I'm not saying that you need to talk about race at every conversation with a diverse person, but don't be afraid to talk about it. And when you do ask people about their reality and their experience, and they begin to share, don't try to talk them out of their reality. Listen with an open heart and probe for clarity. And if something they say makes you uncomfortable, then that's a sign that you got to ask more questions. Say, help me understand why you say that, or why do you feel that way? And really try to unpack your own unconscious racism, because it's impossible for people growing up in America, whoever you are, whether you're black or white, not to grow up with feelings of racism. It's impossible for men growing up in a sexist world to not be sexist in some way or another. So it's just part and parcel of us living in the water that we live. And we need to be able to overcome it by educating ourselves. Let me talk about the fourth thing, and then I'll come to a close. I have a fourth and a fifth item, and then we'll get to talking. The fourth thing is check your sense of reality versus your ideal reality. When I was in college, I took a women's studies class, and I had been raised already by 5 older sisters and a mother, and I thought of myself as a pretty liberated male. And so I decided to take this women's studies class, also because there were like 300 women in the class and only about 10 guys, so I thought it was a good place to meet women. But I took this class, it was called Women, Social Institutions, and Social Change. And I promise you, it was not a male bashing class, but in spite of believing in the equality of women and men and having been raised with that teaching, because it's a fundamental tenet of the Baha'i faith, I was confronted in that class every single day with the reality that women experience in the world and the culture of violence that truly exists in the world. And every single day that I went to that class, I started slouching down further and further in my seat. It was outright painful to see, because I thought to myself, I have these 5 sisters that I love. I have my mother that I love. And how can it be that they have to live in this kind of world? And it became a real threat to me. And I knew that I have to be part of the solution. And we all have to internalize the issues, understanding that we are part of the same human family. And what is affecting people like George Floyd is affecting people who are part of our same human family. And we have to be part of the solution. And so the last thing I want to leave you with is helping to build bridges among diverse people, promoting close association, friendship, and fellowship across racial and ethnic lines. You know, the late Thurgood Marshall, the first African Americans to serve on the Supreme Court, after almost 20 years on the court, he said the justice system can force open doors and sometimes even knock down walls, but what it cannot do is build bridges. And that responsibility belongs to you and you and you. In the 1980s, the Baha'i community also published a compilation entitled Race Unity, America's Most Challenging Issue, that I hope Carolyn and Rick will make available to all of you, because it's truly worthy of study and reflection. And in this compilation, it offers a tremendous amount of guidance on dealing with the racial issue in America. But it says that no change in race relations will come about without close association, friendship, and fellowship among diverse people. It's really only when we start to see the oneness of each other that we will break down the barriers that keep us apart. And so that close association, friendship, and fellowship is vital to the work that lies ahead. I hope you will forgive me for my emotions, but I wanted to just give us a starting point for any dialogue or discussion that you guys might want to have. Okay.